Welcome to our program tonight called American Independence to celebrate our country's 250th anniversary. Tonight's program is made possible by generous donations to our Library Foundation. My name is Tanya Misselt. I am the library director for those who do not know me. Most of you know the library has been under renovation, and we are about 3 months from being finished. We're super excited to be soon starting the last phase. And I want to let you know that some of the things that are coming are upgrades to the technology in the lower level. So we are in the midst of, we actually had to dust off the old equipment and bring it back down here for tonight. And I want to apologize. We do not have shades behind us, so we are not able to pull the shades if anybody's got any light in their eyes. I apologize for that. But then I want to talk about the format for tonight. So we obviously have the in-person group here. It's a great crowd. If you want to get up and get drinks or snacks while we're presenting, that's fine. We also are live streaming tonight, and we are recording this program for later viewing. After I introduce our speaker, you'll have a chance to answer questions. Please ask your questions loudly enough that people who are watching from home can hear you. Following the presentation, there'll be autographed copies of Dr. Weddle's book, and then they'll be available for purchase over here. I also want to encourage you to take a moment to explore our new local history exhibit created by Jane Hoffman and Julie Hubble. They're here. Jane, are you here? And what about Julie? Are you here? Thank you, Julie. Who serve on the River Falls Historical Preservation Commission and are active members of the Pierce County Historical Society. The exhibit titled River Falls 250 Years Ago explores the region, what the region was like during the era of the Revolutionary War. There was things happening here back then. It is my great honor to introduce you to our presenter tonight. Kevin Weddle is an award-winning military historian, retired Army colonel, and distinguished fellow at the U.S. Army College. He graduated in 1979 from the United States Military Academy at West Point. He has a bachelor's in science of civil engineering. He graduated in 1986 from University of Minnesota and has a master's degree in civil engineering and a master's degree in American history. He graduated in 2002 from Princeton University with a doctorate in American history. He served 28 years from 1979 to 2007 on active duty in the U.S. Army before retiring as colonel. He was a combat engineer officer, a brigade command select, a commander of the 299th Engineer Battalion, 4th Infantry Division. He's an author of a book titled Lincoln's Tragic Admiral, The Life of Samuel Francis DuPont, published in 2006. It's an award-winning book. He's a professor of military theory and strategy. He was from 2007 to 2023 at the United States War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. He's the author of a book titled The Compleat Victory, Saratoga and the American Revolution, published in 2021. And he's got about 5 awards on that book, but I'll just leave it with that. Presently, he is a distinguished fellow at the United States Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Please join me in welcoming Colonel Kevin Weddle.
Well, thank you, Tanya, and thanks for everybody coming out on this beautiful day. I'm sure you had a lot of things you could have done, so I really appreciate that. And Tanya, thank you so much. Kim, thank you so much for making this happen. Really appreciate that. Now, I'm not going to, as a native Minnesotan, I'm not going to talk about the age-old Vikings versus Packers controversy, except to say that go Vikings. Yeah, I know that's dangerous, isn't it? Starting off like that. I'm sure several of you are marking me down right now. with the 250th anniversary of American independence coming up, thought this would be a great time to talk about one of the most pivotal campaigns in American history, one of those pivotal military campaigns in American history and in world history, because this campaign, the Saratoga campaign that I'm going to talk about tonight, changed the very character of the American Revolution, and the reverberations of what had happened back in 1777 continue with us today. Now, this campaign is, again, one of the most fascinating you're ever going to run into because, for many different reasons. One of the reasons is it was very long. It was very unusual for the American Revolution. It was 5 months long. It played out over 2,000 square miles of American territory, most of it wilderness territory in upstate New York. It included 10 battles and engagements over the course of this 5 months. And it included personalities that, again, are as fascinating as any you're ever going to run across. And again, most importantly, though, is it changed the American Revolution. And it really was the campaign that helped guarantee American independence. Now, in late August 1777, Britain's King George III received momentous news, and he was so excited about it that he burst into his wife's chambers, shocking the ladies in waiting. Apparently this was against protocol, waving this message in the air and exclaiming, "I have beat them, I have beat the Americans." Now, what excited the king so much is that he had just received news that British Lieutenant General John Burgoyne and his 10,000-man army, consisting of British regulars, German regulars, Canadian loyalist troops, and Native American troops, had just captured the great American fortress at Fort Ticonderoga, which guarded the famous invasion route from Canada to and from Canada, that guarded the confluence of Lake Champlain, which you see in the background there, and Lake George, and leading right into the Hudson River Valley. So this was considered critical for the British to beat the Americans, and so he thought, the king rightfully thought, that the campaign that they had put into place the preceding spring was going exactly according to plan. But less than 2 months after the king's impromptu celebration, General John Burgoyne and his troops met with an unprecedented disaster. And so that's what we're going to talk about tonight. Now, we could talk about the causes of the American Revolution. We'd be here all night. We'd be here tomorrow. We'd be here through the end of next week, probably. So I'm not going to do that. But what I do want to do is spend just a couple minutes talking about some of the military campaigns that take place before Saratoga, so you can get an idea, kind of putting it into context. So if you look at the major campaigns, the major military actions of the American Revolution, of course, started off with a shot heard around the world, the Battle of Lexington and Concord, just outside of Boston, Massachusetts in April 75. The Americans will seize Fort Ticonderoga from the British without firing a shot, and they do that in May of 75, so right after hostilities begin. Then the Battle of Bunker Hill takes place outside of Boston in June of 75. George Washington, just 251 years ago, almost to the date, is named Commander-in-Chief of the brand new Continental Army, and he will travel up to Boston to take command of the troops up there. So remember, this is a full year before the Declaration of Independence. So we're actually fighting this revolution before the Declaration of Independence even takes place. The Americans will try to seize Canada. So we haven't just coveted Canada recently. We've actually wanted Canada for a long, long time. And back during the American Revolution, one of the things that George Washington and the Continental Congress wanted were the Canadians to come over on our side, especially the French Canadians. But that campaign ends in an utter total disaster for the Americans, and they are not successful in seizing Canada. The British will try and fail to seize Charleston in February of 1776, and then the British will evacuate Boston in March of 76. And for actually several months, there are no British troops in the 13 colonies. I hope you, by the way, I hope you appreciated my animation going up. Yeah, I thought you would. So one nice thing about the only nice thing I can think of an assignment at the Pentagon is you really learn PowerPoint pretty well. So I did learn PowerPoint, not a whole lot else, but I did learn PowerPoint. Well, the British will come back, though. And in the summer and fall of 76, they will come back under their new commander-in-chief, General William Howe. They will land at Staten Island, and they'll proceed to defeat Washington in battle after battle after battle on Long Island and then Manhattan. And Washington's army, Washington is kicked off of Manhattan. The British seize the best port in the Western Hemisphere, basically, in New York. And Washington starts retreating across New Jersey. And as he's doing that, the army is falling apart. Howe is nipping at his heels, and it looks like the revolution is at its end. But Washington will turn the tide in the Battle of Trenton, the famous crossing of the Delaware. He will beat a British outpost of Hessian mercenaries at Trenton, New Jersey, on Christmas Day, and he'll follow that up a few days later with another victory, the Battle of Princeton, in January of 1777. So these twin battles, which are really very small, they're not much more than raids, but Washington will basically turn the tide, and he'll rejuvenate the American war effort. He'll stop the desertions after this, and more Americans will come join the army, and Washington basically saves the revolution. So after the battles of Trenton and Princeton, now the British sit back and they go, okay, let's come up with a new strategy for 1777 to end this thing once and for all. We almost had this thing licked here at the end of 1776. It didn't work. Let's finish this. These motley Americans, we ought to be able to crush them pretty easily if we just kind of, think about what we're going to do for 1777. So one of the most confusing and I think interesting things about this whole campaign in 1777 is how the British came up with their military strategy for 1777. Now, you've heard that, you hear that word all the time, right? The word strategy. I mean, you hear it in a football game. Well, what's the Packers strategy here for the second half, and things like that. Typically, they're using that word absolutely wrong. That's not what strategy is. So strategy, I taught strategy for many years at the Army War College, and the definition I really like is the calculated application of ways and means to achieve a political objective. Now, that sounds really, really interesting and simple, or sounds interesting. It sounds very simple, and it is kind of simple, but it's also not easy. And in fact, if it was easy, I think we'd be a lot better at it. And we haven't been very good at it, I would argue, since World War II. But that's what they were they have to come up with, how do we use our finite military resources to achieve this political objective? And the political objective, of course, is to defeat the American Revolution. So these are the primary architects of British military strategy in 1777. First, you have the king. Then over here on the right, you have General Sir William Howe. He is the British Commander-in-Chief in North America. Down here, you have Lieutenant General John Burgoyne. John Burgoyne was the second in command in Canada. Now, in early 1777, he's back in London. And then this fellow over here is Lord George Germain. He is Secretary of State for the colonies. So his job is to basically manage the war in North America for the king. So that he's a former general, and that's his job. So these are the four people who will kind of have their hands in coming up with this British plan to defeat the Americans once and for all in 1777. So in late 76 and early 1777, Generals Howe and Burgoyne will both offer up competing plans for how they think the war should be conducted in 1777. And just before we continue on, I just want to point out, I just absolutely love that portrait of John Burgoyne. And having served almost 30 years in the Army, I can tell you that's what every cavalryman likes to think of himself as. The dashing cavalryman. And that's, of course, what John Burgoyne was. And, of course, if you marry into a very rich aristocratic family like John Burgoyne, you can hire the greatest portrait painter of the age, Sir Joshua Reynolds, to paint your portrait. Apparently, General Howe didn't have that kind of money. Well, at any rate, General, let's take a look at their two plans. So this is Burgoyne's plan. Now, remember, Burgoyne is in London, so he's able to present his plan directly to the king and and Lord George Germain. So his plan is interesting. It's quite complex. It's pretty imaginative. What it calls for is 3 converging columns. Basically, the main army that's up here in Canada will come down Lake Champlain, actually south on Lake Champlain, seize Fort Ticonderoga, onto Lake George, and then into the Hudson River Valley, all the way down to Albany, New York. And then a supporting column will come up the St. Lawrence River into Lake Ontario, and then down the Mohawk River all the way to Albany. And then it also finally calls for the main British Army, which is sitting here in New York, to come up the Hudson River, all of these armies basically combining at Albany. The idea was to split what they thought were the more rebellious New England colonies away from what they thought were the less rebellious New York and Philadelphia, New York, Pennsylvania, middle colonies, and the southern colonies as well. So it was to seize control of the Hudson River Valley and then conduct some other military operations up into New England. So again, pretty imaginative, but also very complex. And imagine trying to pull that off in the mid 18th century. Be pretty challenging. But the king and Lord Germain absolutely loved this plan. They thought it was just great. So General Howe, remember, he's the commander-in-chief sitting here in New York City. He has a completely different plan. He is convinced that by this time of the war, especially after Trenton and Princeton, he's convinced that George Washington and his army is the center of gravity for the American Revolution. In other words, in order to defeat the American Revolution, you had to defeat Washington and the army. And that was the only way you were going to do it. So his plan is to use Philadelphia as bait. Philadelphia is where the Second Continental Congress is sitting, so it's kind of the nominal capital of the new United States. And then he's going to put his army on ships, guarded by the Royal Navy, commanded by his brother, which is convenient, and then sail all the way down into the Chesapeake Bay, sail up the Chesapeake Bay, land at the head of the Chesapeake Bay, and then threaten Philadelphia. And this will force Washington to come and defend it. And then Howe would have his opportunity to have the big decisive victory that would win the revolution. So that's General Howe's idea. So as you can see, 2 very, very different plans. So it's got to be up to Lord Germain to reconcile those plans. Well, they've got a problem with that, though. If you're trying to do that and you've got one decision maker sitting there in New York, and you've got the other 3 decision makers sitting there in London, it might be kind of hard to coordinate those strategies. Why? Well, because it takes almost 3 months for an exchange of messages at this point. Today, of course, you just get on a video conference, you get on Zoom, and you'd figure out what you're going to do. Well, they couldn't do that. So you would send a message, and it would take at least 6 weeks to go one way. And then, of course, the reply takes at least 6 weeks to go the other way. Now, I'm sure you're all sitting out there and you're going, oh, I know exactly what happened. And you're exactly right. Because what happens is messages will cross. People will get confused. People will misunderstand orders. A clarification of orders take forever to get there, and sometimes by the time they get there, it's too late. And so that's exactly what happened. So what I did in my book, I actually traced every message that went back and forth between these 4 fellows, and there were many, there were dozens of them, and traced them all, when they were sent, when they were received, and the reply. And you can just, and I put it in an appendix in my book, and you can almost just kind of trace the breadcrumbs. You can watch the strategy fall apart as these messages go back and forth. And that's what happens. And so what they end up doing, just long story short, and maybe we can talk about it more during the Q&A, but basically Lord George Germain and the king will approve Burgoyne's plan. They will also approve Howe's plan. But they tell Howe, hey, once you finish doing your Philadelphia thing, which we don't think will take very long, then you go up the Hudson River and help out Burgoyne. But poor old Howe doesn't receive that message till he's already at sea, and by then it's way too late. And so what ends up happening is, instead of having one coherent military strategy where you're using all of your military might and it's always finite, all of your military might going against one objective, you have two utterly uncoordinated strategies happening. And so, what's happened is they've frittered away their military resources. And so it will, what I argue in the book is almost everything that happens in this campaign can be traced back to this faulty strategy. There's other things, there's unexamined assumptions. It's not clear who's overall in charge, and things like that. So maybe we can talk about that again some more. So that kicks off this campaign. So Burgoyne will leave Canada almost exactly 251 years ago. 249 years ago, about last week. He will leave from Canada and start heading south, and he'll arrive outside of Fort Ticonderoga on the 2nd of July. His supporting force, commanded by a guy named Brigadier General Barry St. Leger, will leave around the same time, but he's got farther to go. And he will arrive at the head of the Mohawk River Valley on the 2nd of August. General Howe will load his troops onto ships on the 10th of July, but he can't even sail for 3 weeks because of contrary winds. This is all sailing vessels at the time. So he couldn't even get out of New York Harbor for 3 weeks. Once he finally does, it takes him almost a month to get to the head of the Chesapeake Bay. So he doesn't land at the head of the Chesapeake Bay until the end of August. So as you can see, you can already see there's going to be timing issues involved. The main American army is commanded by George Washington. He's in New Jersey. He's trying to figure out what Howe is doing. And then you have another American army up there in the north commanded by Major General Philip Schuyler. So these are the comparison of forces between Burgoyne and Schuyler, because those are going to be our two major protagonists there. And yes, it's true. It's been pointed out to me the way I have this laid out here. It looks like I'm saying that all these numbers add up to 1,800. Of course, they don't. They don't add up. Honestly, I used to be an engineer. But basically, this is Burgoyne's force here, and this is the supporting force going down the Mohawk River. So it's about 10,000 up here and almost 2,000 there, and that's what the Americans have there. Major General Philip Schuyler, has anybody seen the musical Hamilton? Or you've heard of it? Yeah, you heard. Well, this is Hamilton's future father-in-law. So he is commanding the American forces up in the north, up in New York. Major General Philip Schuyler. He served in the French and Indian War. He's a very capable administrator. He's really good with logistics and things like that, supplies, but he's not particularly well liked by the troops. In fact, New England troops despise him. They absolutely despise him. So that's gonna lead to some problems. General John Burgoyne, a really interesting guy. He serves his entire adult life in the British Army. He's a cavalryman. Again, a very flamboyant, kind of aggressive guy. Again, like every cavalryman I've ever known in my career. It's that branch kind of attracts people like that, which is good. That's what you want. For that particular skill, so he's very good at that. He's also kind of arrogant and very self-confident guy. Of course, you want that too, to a certain extent, but his troops really like him, and that's very unusual for that period of time for a professional army. But his troops like him a lot. So he's a very popular guy. He's also a playwright. He writes several romantic comedies that are performed in Britain and are very well received. In fact, he's buried in Westminster Abbey because of his playwright ability. He was also a member of Parliament, and he's a favorite of King George III. So you can see, though, the Brits, they have British regulars. They also have German troops along with them. They have some Canadians. You see 500 Native Americans are going to support the Brits here. And this other supporting column will have a combination of German troops, British troops, and mostly Native Americans, though. The Americans will have, as you can see, about 5,500 Continentals. So those are the long service troops. Those are the ones who have signed up for say, 2 years or 3 years or the duration of the war. and then 1,500 militia. These are the local self-defense forces. So that's what Schuyler has. So Schuyler is heavily outnumbered, especially at the beginning of this campaign. So as I mentioned before, Burgoyne will arrive outside of Fort Ticonderoga on the 2nd of July. Now, he thought that Ticonderoga would be the hardest part of this whole campaign. He thought it's going to take a while to capture Fort Ticonderoga, so he actually brought a bunch of heavy guns because he thought he'd have to have a siege. And because also Fort Ticonderoga was known as the Gibraltar of North America, it was thought to be almost impregnable. So Burgoyne thought it would take quite a while to capture. But he was lucky because the American commander there is this guy. So Burgoyne is very lucky in his opponent. This is Major General Arthur Sinclair. He's a former British Army officer. There's several former British Army officers in the American service during the American Revolution. Sinclair is one of them. And I mean, there's no issues of him having British sympathies or anything like that. He's just incompetent. That's all, just incompetent. And he is commanding here. Now, he's given a really tough job. He's given this job about 2 weeks before the British show up, but he does virtually nothing to prepare this garrison and the fort. And the most important thing and most incompetent thing he does is there's a large hill. Has anybody ever been to Fort Ticonderoga? Okay, so you've been, a couple people have. So you know, number one, it's a beautiful place to visit. I mean, just absolutely gorgeous scenery around there. I recommend it to anybody who, you go to New York, I recommend heading up there. It's absolutely gorgeous. This is Lake Champlain here, and on down here to the south of it is Lake George. So right next to Fort Ticonderoga is a very high hill. It's called Sugarloaf Hill, and the Americans had renamed it Mount Defiance. And it looks right down into the fort if you're on top of it. In fact, this picture was taken from the top of Mount Defiance, looking right down into it. The Americans, even though they had been advised to put some troops up on top of Mount Defiance, they don't. So Mount Defiance is totally unmanned. Mainly because they thought, well, it's a very rocky hill. It's very, very steep. Nobody's going to go up there. Well, the British arrive, and they immediately, first thing they do is they see this huge hill. And Burgoyne turns to his second in command, a guy named General Phillips, who's this career artillery officer. And he says, Phillips, I want you to put an artillery battery up on that hill. And he goes, yes, sir. And one of Phillips' staff officers said, sir, that's crazy. Only a mountain goat could climb that hill. And Phillips supposedly replied, well, where a mountain goat can go, a man can go, and where a man can go, you can drag a gun. So the Brits do. In the matter of several hours, they're able to place an entire artillery battery on top of this hill. And so they look right down into the fort. And this spooks Sinclair, and he orders the evacuation of the fort. So in a matter of a couple days, almost without firing a shot, Burgoyne is able to march into Fort Ticonderoga virtually unopposed. The Americans will escape across a bridge that they have built across Lake Champlain here. It's very narrow there. They cross over and they retreat to the east. And so in a matter of days, Fort Ticonderoga has fallen. George Washington, the commander-in-chief, Congress, they had all been told, they all had been assured that Fort Ticonderoga was utterly impregnable. There's no way they could lose it. And instead, they lose it within a couple days. So the morale on the American side is just absolutely rock bottom. And in fact, Congress, and not so much Washington, but Congress, some of the governors of the states in the area think that clearly treason that's the only way. And, you know, clearly Sinclair has to be treasonous. He had to give it up to the Brits because he wanted to. Same with Schuyler, because Sinclair was under Schuyler. Again, there's no treason involved. It was just incompetence. But at any rate, horrible morale disaster. In fact, John Adams will write his wife Abigail, and he'll say something along the lines of, you know, we're never going to hold a fort until we shoot a general. We have to make these guys sit up and take notice, or else we're never going to hold on to these positions. Well, at any rate, Burgoyne is thrilled about this, and of course this feeds into his overconfidence. He already doesn't have a whole lot of respect for Americans or American soldiers. This is going to exacerbate that feeling. So he's absolutely thrilled, and that's what led to the king's excited celebration later once he receives that message that Ticonderoga has been seized so easily late in August. So the first phase has worked out very, very well for Burgoyne. He's pretty happy about that. Now, Barry St. Leger, he runs into a different issue. So as he's heading down, remember his job is to go down the Mohawk River, and he's going to meet Burgoyne there at Albany. Well, once he arrives outside the Mohawk River, there's a fort there, and his intelligence had led him to believe that this is an old French and Indian fort. It was 20 years old. He thought it was basically crumbling, and in fact that the Americans probably wouldn't even man that fort. Instead, he finds this. He finds a well-repaired fort manned by a plucky 600-man American garrison commanded by this fellow, Colonel Peter Gansevoort. He's only about 23 years old at the time. This was painted much, much later, but he's there, and so General St. Leger, the British general, he clearly outnumbers these Americans. So he sends in a flag of truce and with a messenger, and he goes to Colonel Gansevoort, and he says, "Unless you surrender this fort, we're going to put you all to death." And so Gansevoort goes, "Whoa, okay, I hadn't heard a message like that since the medieval period, but okay." And he said, "Nope. The Congress has given me the mission to hold on to this fort, and that's what I'm going to do." And in fact, Gansevoort and this small American garrison will hold on to this fort for a 22-day siege, finally forcing St. Leger to retreat back up into Canada. So they do a brilliant job, and it's a fascinating comparison of leadership between the leadership at Fort Ticonderoga and the leadership here at Fort Stanwix in upstate New York. So this is the reconstructed fort. The National Park Service has reconstructed the fort exactly how it looked like in August of 1777. So it's a great place to visit. Again, if you're ever up in upstate New York, visiting the Erie Canal or something like that near Rome, New York, you can go visit that. It's very, very well worth the effort. So, but the bottom line is St. Leger's force is turned back because of these very tough Americans in that small force of Americans at Fort Stanwix. And this is the first bit of good news the Americans have had for the last 7 months. They haven't had any good news since the battles of Trenton and Princeton 7 months before. So they're thrilled that Fort Stanwix was able to hold out over this much larger British force. And in fact, at that point, John Adams writes his wife Abigail again. Remember, he had just said we need to shoot some generals here. He said, well, maybe we don't have to shoot some generals. Maybe we just have to find some decent leaders and put them in these positions. Okay, so you've got that column now is gone. So they retreated all the way back into Canada. Ultimately, St. Leger will try to link up with Burgoyne, but he never gets close. So that does not work out. So now with Howe heading toward Philadelphia, and now this column has been turned back. Now it's Burgoyne, and we're going to zero in on this box here and talk about the rest of the campaign. So just to orient you now to the map, here you have Fort Ticonderoga up here. This is the southern tip of Lake Champlain right here. This is Lake George right here, and this is the Hudson River Valley right here. So Schuyler, the American General Schuyler, is here with the American Army. The American garrison from Fort Ticonderoga, they have escaped to the east, and Burgoyne has immediately sent a force after them, and they catch up with them at a little tiny hamlet called Hubbardton, right there. It's and they fight the only battle that was fought in Vermont during the course of the American Revolution. So the pursuing force will catch up to the American garrison here at Hubbardton. the American commander Sinclair has left a small force behind to basically protect the rest of the garrison as they're trying to escape. And this force basically sacrifices themselves at the Battle of Hubbardton. So the Americans will lose that battle, but the British will stop their pursuit, allowing the rest of the American garrison to get away. They will ultimately make their way down and link up with Schuyler here. So Burgoyne has seized Ticonderoga. He's won the Battle of Hubbardton. He has moved his army. He will move his army down to the southern tip of Lake Champlain at a place called Skenesboro, a little hamlet down there. He will defeat the Americans, an American force there at Skenesboro as well. And then he'll wait about 2 weeks while he's gathering some more logistics, gathering supplies, and getting ready to go. Now, and to get ready to make his push on to Albany. Now, Schuyler, in the meantime, he's sending this series of messages back to Washington and Congress, basically saying, oh my God, the sky is falling. Burgoyne has seized Ticonderoga. I don't know what to do. There's nothing I can do to stop him. Woe is me. The sky is falling. Our cause is doomed. I mean, just message after message after message. And Washington's going like, whoa. Geez, maybe we don't have the right guy up there. But at any rate, Washington does his best to help out. But as a great lesson for senior leaders, I think you really need to, you got to know how to communicate, because while Schuyler is sending all these negative messages, he's actually doing a pretty good job delaying Burgoyne. So, because once Burgoyne starts heading south, Schuyler has sent his troops to basically raid Burgoyne as he's heading south. He sends these guys to cut down trees to block the paths. Now remember, this is 1777, so there are almost no hamlets, no settlements in the area at all. Just some scattered farms here and there. And so these guys are marching along these little narrow paths through the woods. They're not nice roads. And so Burgoyne is trying to move a 10,000-man army along these narrow paths, and Schuyler is doing a really good job slowing him down. In fact, I calculated it out. Throughout this whole campaign, Burgoyne's army will move less than a mile a day. So it's really hard to win a war when you're moving that slow. So a lot of that can be pinned on Schuyler. I mean, he's doing a pretty good job, but the messages to Washington and Congress don't indicate that at all. So they really start thinking, I'm not sure he's the right guy. In the meantime, as Burgoyne slowly moves south, Schuyler will move the army south. He's basically doing what we call in the military trading space for time. And in the meantime, because it's taking so long for Burgoyne to move south, Burgoyne starts to run into logistical problems. He's running out of supplies, and he doesn't have enough transport and animals to pull his transport, like oxen, mules, and horses. He doesn't have enough animals and transport to pull the supplies he has. So he starts running into big-time logistical problems. He'll continue south. He'll move all the way to a place called Fort Miller, which is a dilapidated old French and Indian fort. The Americans, again, have been trying to slow him down as he moves south. Once he gets to Fort Miller now, he's in deep logistical trouble. But he gets intelligence that down here at a place called Bennington, Vermont, little town called Bennington, there's a herd of cattle, and there's also a bunch of carts and wagons and things like that, things that he needs. So he decides to send a force out to raid and capture this cattle, and then that would alleviate his logistical problems. So he takes a 1,000-man force, and he will send them to Bennington to try to seize those supplies. And as they're moving toward Bennington, the Americans will catch word, will figure out that they're moving, and an American militia force under a guy named John Stark, Brigadier General John Stark, will advance with his militia and basically destroy this 1,000-man detachment. So Burgoyne will lose 1,000 men in one day at the Battle of Bennington. Now, most of those guys have been captured. They haven't been killed or wounded, but still, he's lost 1,000 men, and he's deep into the wilderness, and it's really hard for him to replace those guys. Now, in the meantime, the Americans, they've relieved Schuyler. They've had enough of his negative vibes. They've dumped him, and they've replaced him with this guy. This guy is another former British Army officer named Horatio Gates. So Horatio Gates, he is an old friend of George Washington. They served together in the French and Indian War. He liked America. He loved his time in America. And when he goes back to Britain, he's from a modest background. He doesn't really think he's got much of a future in the British Army. So he sells his commission and he moves his family to America, becomes Americanized. And so when the war breaks out, he offers his services to the Americans. Washington is so appreciative that he's got somebody with some military background. He names him Adjutant General of the Army. So big job, but he is itching. He wants an independent command. He thinks he's better than Washington. He thinks he knows more than Washington. So they have a bit of a falling out by this time, but he finally gets his wish. He gets an independent command, and now he's in command of the Northern Army. He immediately starts moving the army north to face Burgoyne, and he likes Americans, and he likes the American militia, and he knows how to use them. So he's one of the very few generals, especially former British generals, who feel like that. And the Americans like him, unlike Schuyler, who was a native-born American, but the Americans don't like him. The Americans like this guy, this former Brit. So he also believes in defensive warfare. So he moves his army north until he can find a nice place to defend, a nice high ground, and it's at a place called Bemis Heights. And he orders his guys to dig in there. Well, Burgoyne will make a really critical decision. He'll decide to cross over the Hudson River to the west bank, and he'll continue south toward Albany. And these two armies will finally clash on the 19th of September, 1777, at the first battle of Saratoga, called the Battle of Freeman's Farm. Now, it's a bitter battle. It's one of the nastiest battles of the war, but the British will hold on to the battlefield, so they're able to claim a victory. But the Americans will inflict 3 times the amount of casualties on the British that the Americans will suffer. So then these are casualties that the British cannot afford. Now, both armies at this battle are about 6,000 men strong when they fight this battle. But very, very quickly, mainly because Gates has been named in command, American militia starts flowing in from the surrounding states. And so in a matter of days, the American army has increased to 11,000 from 6,000, just in days, because all these militia forces flowing in, whereas Burgoyne is not able to increase his army at all. In fact, his army, by this time, he has reduced rations 5 times. His army is starting to starve. His animals are starting to starve. They're exhausted. I've covered many weeks here in just a couple minutes talking, but of course I go over it all in depth. But this is in the book. But this was one of the hottest and wettest summers that they had experienced in decades. And so for the British, by the time they get down here, their tents are basically rotted. So they're no longer waterproof. Their uniforms are almost rotting off their bodies by this time. So they are in deep trouble. So Burgoyne decides at this point he's going to dig in, and he starts sending messages out asking for help. And while he does, so let me just take a very quick aside. While all this is going on, you've got 2 commanders-in-chief who are facing each other. This is General Howe. We've already met him. And, of course, George Washington. Now, both of these guys are commanders-in-chief of their respective countries' efforts in North America. Washington is commander-in-chief of all of the American military, and he's also commanding the main army. Same with Howe. That's his job as well. So we're comparing apples to apples. But during this campaign, even though Washington never gets closer than 300 miles away from what's going on in upstate New York, and he's fighting his own battles around Philadelphia, he's acting as a true commander-in-chief. He's providing support, he's providing reinforcements, he's sending help up to Schuyler and then later Gates. And his help, Washington's help, is instrumental in the Americans' overall success in Saratoga. Whereas Howe, even though I think Howe had absolutely the right idea, defeat Washington and then you win the American Revolution, he is not acting as a commander-in-chief. He is acting as an army commander, and that's all. So he's basically saying, Burgoyne, you are on your own. And he is totally focused on Washington. So I found that, you know, the amateur Washington, who's basically learning on the job on how to be a great military leader, is doing a much better job in this campaign as a commander-in-chief than Howe, the lifelong professional officer from the British Army. Kind of counterintuitive. Well, at any rate, Burgoyne's pleas end up down here in New York for help, and his old friend, General Sir Guy Carleton, is down here. He is Howe's second in command. He's been left behind. Howe has gone to Philadelphia, but Clinton has been left behind to basically hold on to New York City, that important port. And Burgoyne asks for help. He pleads with Clinton to send help. So Clinton pulls together a 3,000-man force, and he sails up the Hudson River to try to at least kind of relieve some of the pressure on Burgoyne up here. And he quickly seizes two American forts, Fort Clinton and Fort Montgomery. These are American forts. The Clinton is no relation to this Clinton. But have any of you ever been to West Point? No? If you ever get a chance to get up there, these forts are just south of West Point. So West Point wasn't a thing yet. West Point doesn't really become a thing until the year after this campaign takes place. So he seizes these two forts. He continues up the river, and he will burn the capital of New York State. At the time, it was not Albany. It was Kingston, New York. He burns Kingston to the ground, which provides the Americans with a great propaganda tool to use against the Brits. But he never gets closer than about 70 miles of Burgoyne. So he's not able to help out Burgoyne because there's just too many American troops between him and Burgoyne. Well, this is a picture that's in my book. I took this several years ago. It's from the American positions up at Bemis Heights. You can see this high ground overlooks the road to Albany and the Hudson River. So there's really no way that Burgoyne can get to Albany without going through the Americans on Bemis Heights. Well, Burgoyne now he is desperate. His men are starving. His choice is basically fall back or continue to push on. He kind of takes a middle ground. He puts together a 1,700-man reconnaissance force. They come out of these fortifications to try to find some food because he needs to have that big a force to protect guys who are looking for food. And they find on the 7th of October, they come out of their fortifications. They immediately run into a field of unharvested wheat. So they started gathering all this stuff. The Americans have spotted their movement. So the Americans immediately attack. And almost immediately, this 1,700-man reconnaissance force starts falling apart. American sharpshooters are picking off officers. In fact, Burgoyne will lose his best combat commander, a brigadier general named Simon Fraser, to an American sharpshooter. And by the end of the day, an American force led by Benedict Arnold, yes, that Benedict Arnold, will have seized basically the far right fortification of Burgoyne's army. And at that point, Burgoyne has no choice. He has to fall back. And that's what he decides to do. And this is the second battle of Saratoga, also called the Battle of Bemis Heights. The Americans will inflict about 5 times the amount of casualties on the British at this battle. But Burgoyne can't do anything now at this point. The Americans outnumber him now about 11,000 to 6,000, and Burgoyne can do nothing but start to fall back. As they do, they start falling back in a cold, driving rain. This is now October. And these men are starving. They're absolutely exhausted, and Burgoyne's retreat will grind to a halt at a place called Saratoga with Gates close behind. And by this time, the American army has now swollen to 17,000. So they quickly surround Burgoyne, and it's over. And after a period of several days of tense negotiations, Burgoyne will surrender his army on the 17th of October, 1777, in a ceremony where an American band is playing Yankee Doodle. And Burgoyne will present his sword to Gates. Gates will graciously hand his sword back to him. But this famous painting is hanging in the U.S. Capitol Rotunda. So it's one of those huge, 30-foot by 20-foot paintings. So anything, when you see TV, coverage of big events happening in the Capitol Rotunda, you'll probably catch a glimpse of the surrender at Saratoga. This is the first time in history that a British army has surrendered. So it's a huge deal. There's only 2 British armies in North America. They've just lost one. So as you can imagine, British morale will plummet, American morale will soar. And with all of the ramifications that you can imagine, now the British have a problem. They have actually multiple problems. Not only have you lost that army, but the French have been teetering on supporting the Americans or not. They basically, whether they're thinking about supporting us or not, basically kind of ebbs and flows with the military operations. And so the last word that the French had received was that the Americans had evacuated Philadelphia and the British had captured Ticonderoga. So the French are going, yeah, I'm not sure. But news of Burgoyne's surrender will arrive in London on the 2nd of December, 1777, and the city will be plunged into despair. 2 days later, the news will arrive in Paris, and Paris erupts in celebration, and the French will decide to reopen up negotiations. And in lightning fast time, in diplomatic terms, the Americans and the British, fortunately, we had one of our greatest diplomats ever, Benjamin Franklin, leading our diplomatic effort in Paris. He has developed a great relationship with the French Foreign Minister Vergennes. They agree. They convinced Louis XVI to sign a treaty of alliance with the Americans. And 2 months after news arrives in Paris, the Americans and the French will sign this treaty. So the war now changes completely, because now the British are faced with something that they've been trying to avoid the whole time, a wider war. Now, instead of it just being a war against these annoying Americans, now it's become a worldwide conflict. The British now have to worry about, with the French coming in on our side, and the Spanish will come in on our side the year later, the British will have to now worry about not only defeating the American Revolution, but also defending their possessions in the West Indies, defending their possessions in the East Indies, Gibraltar, all their possessions in the Mediterranean. And it truly becomes a second world war. The first one was the 7 Years' War that took place 20 years before this. Now they're dealing with a second world war. And so the Americans, on the other hand, now we have an ally. And Winston Churchill once famously said, the only thing worse than fighting with allies is fighting without one. And we kind of learned that pretty quickly. The French are kind of a pain in the neck to deal with. But ultimately, the French will land an army under General Rochambeau here in Rhode Island in 1780, and he'll ultimately link up with Washington's army, and they will defeat the British at the final major campaign, the Siege of Yorktown, in October of 1781, which is the last major military campaign. So I would argue that you could never have had a Yorktown without a Saratoga. It didn't have to be Saratoga necessarily, but you had to have a Saratoga-like event to get the French to come in on our side, and consequently changing the entire character of the American Revolution. And of course, we have been friends, sometimes difficult friends, but we have been friends with the French ever since. It's been the longest alliance, really, certainly one of the longest recent alliances in history. So, and as one American general wrote the day after Burgoyne's surrender, it was the complete victory. So, thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions. Sir.
Name was Leger.
Yeah. Right.
Step forward. Is there something in your training background, military training, that would prevent him from, or maybe it's just some topography, from just bypassing, or why even gave?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. So the question is, for the folks who might be streaming at home, the question is, why didn't General St. Leger just bypass Fort Stanwix and continue on to Albany? It was really kind of the doctrine, the way they fought at the time, and that was you had to have secure lines of communications back to your rear. And so he felt that he couldn't have that fort in his rear because he had a supply base at the lake. Couldn't talk about everything, but at Oswego, place called Oswego, right on Lake Ontario. That was his main supply base. So he thought there's no way I can leave an American force in my rear. So that was the reasoning behind that. Yeah, great question. And as part of all that, I mean, it's a 550-page book, so we're just kind of skimming the surface. But that campaign is one of the most interesting ones, I think, because it really showcases how the American Revolution, in part, is a civil war. Because they're brothers fighting against brothers in that part of this campaign, because there are loyalist forces, Americans who are loyal to the crown, many Americans loyal to the crown in the Mohawk River Valley, and many on the Patriot side, and they're fighting each other. And it's in fact, they fight each other in one of the bloodiest battles of the entire war, the Battle of Oriskany. Most people have never heard of it, but it was part of that campaign around Fort Stanwix. So great question. Well, yes, sir.
Where do you land on relative importance of Continental Army regulars versus militia in I guess relative importance to one another?
Yeah.
Spelled the citizen soldier a lot, and but have these militia at kind of all the real military emergencies of the war.
Yeah.
You have militia showing up and playing a big part. And I understand that the Continental Army was the only ones holding the line kind of in the mid-war years, at 78 and 80. But do you think we've gone maybe a little too far in our treatment of saying that the Continental Army was more important than local militia at those specific areas?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and just to quickly summarize, for the folks at home, the relative importance of the Continental Army, Continentals versus militia. I think you had to have they complemented each other pretty well, I think. And I think the key is having a general that understood how to use militia. And you had a series of general officers, I think, in the American Army who just didn't know how to use militia properly. I think Schuyler's one of those guys, as an example. There's a couple others that I could name off. But then you had people like Horatio Gates, who understood that you couldn't take militia, who are just the short-term emergency kind of local defense kind of folks who have limited training. You couldn't put them toe-to-toe with the British Army. If you did, you were asking for trouble. So you couldn't use them like that. And if you did, you're probably going to have problems. But you had to have the Continentals in order to do that, and Washington understood this. And so I think Washington understood the importance of the militia, but he definitely, as you rightly said, definitely put his emphasis on the Continental Army. And he makes that decision early in the war. He makes that decision really in the fall of 1776, after he gets defeat after defeat in Long Island and Manhattan. oftentimes because he sees the militia aren't able to stand up to the British regulars. And so he actually, he's writing letters at the time saying, you know, we can't count on militia to win this war. We have to have this, you know, we have to build our own professional army. And that's what he does with the Continental Army. So, but yet later on, you have Daniel Morgan at the Battle of Cowpens, who uses militia brilliantly. And there's a guy who understands how to use militia. So I think the key, they were both very important. If you have a general who understood how to use them, you could really get some good synergy using both of these forces. So I think they're both critical to the success of the American forces. It's a great question. Sir, you had a question?
Was involved as British Army officer and applied for ocean or a mission.
Yep.
Refused. Is that true?
That is true. Yeah, that is true. He is with Braddock at the famous Braddock massacre out near Pittsburgh. So he's with him. He's one of the few survivors. In fact, he's one of the guys who kind of is able to rescue the survivors and get them out of there. His leadership. I mean, he's standing up there, bullets flying left and right, you know, nicking his coat and all. He's one of the very few guys who are unscathed. So the guy was incredibly physically courageous, as well as having a really, really brilliant strategic mind. But yes, absolutely, the British, to their regret, will turn him down for a full-time commission. Yep, that's all he wanted. He wanted to be a British Army officer back then. Yep, yep. One of those great ironies of history, isn't it? Anybody else?
Naturally filling out.
Yeah.
Right. So that when Franklin was returned, heard that Hal was taken from the government, Franklin said, "No, Philadelphia is taking Hal."
Yeah.
Boy, stayed with all the loyalty.
Well, it wasn't so much about the loyalty. You have the quote exactly right. Great job with that. And yes, that is I love that quote. So of course, Philadelphia was Benjamin Franklin's home, and he's over there in Paris. And the day he gets the news of Saratoga is also the day he finds out that Philadelphia has been taken. So the messenger who rides up to him, they're waiting. They heard that a messenger was coming with the latest news, and he and the rest of the diplomats are in the courtyard of the house he was renting there in Paris, and this courier comes riding in, very dramatic, and Franklin, who had heard rumors that Philadelphia had been taken, says, "Is it true that Philadelphia has been taken?" And the messenger says, "Yes, it's true." And you know, all the eyewitnesses says Franklin just like, "Oh, you know, damn." And he started walking away, and he goes, "Well, wait, Dr. Franklin, wait though. I've got other news. General Burgoyne and his entire army have surrendered." And you know, Franklin was like, "Yeah," and he immediately, I mean, like minutes after he gets that news, he writes the first note to the foreign minister saying, "We need to meet. We need to talk about this." And it was then that, you know, other people were arguing, "Yeah, but you've lost Philadelphia," and Franklin says, "No. Philadelphia has captured Clinton," because basically it wasn't so much about the loyalists. It was because he knew Philadelphia was a strategic dead end. So it was, you know, so what? What does that do for you? It doesn't do anything for you, capturing Philadelphia. Yes, that's where Continental Congress was, but the Continental Congress just moved to York. So you haven't captured the Continental Congress. If you had captured the Continental Congress, that might be a big deal. But all he did was capture a geographic point that meant nothing, really. Yeah, he's got some propaganda. You know, there's some propaganda value to it, but in the overall scheme of the war, it means nothing. So that's what he was referring to. That really it doesn't give Clinton, or it doesn't give Howe any advantage. And in fact, the British, how many months later? 7 months later, will march out of Philadelphia back to New York, basically giving Philadelphia back to the Americans, because it was giving them no advantage. They thought Washington was going to come back and try to seize Philadelphia back. Washington had no intention of doing that. So why? I don't need to do that. We don't need to take Philadelphia back. It's not a big deal. So that's why, again, we're kind of Washington's strategic thinking, pretty sharp. Now yes, it's true, he's not winning a lot of battles, but it didn't matter. He had the right strategy. And if you have the right strategy, it almost doesn't matter how many battles you win. As long as you win that last one. The Germans win battle after battle after battle after battle in World War II, but they have a faulty strategy. And they keep on making stupid strategic errors that it doesn't matter that they're winning all these battles. They don't translate to success. Whereas Washington's strategy, which is keep the army intact, don't get sucked into a big decisive victory against this huge British army. And as long as I keep this army intact, the revolution will stay intact. Revolution will stay alive. And he was exactly right. And he makes that decision early in the war, and he sticks with it all the way till the French finally land an army, and he can combine with them and then go against the British. Anybody else? Yes, ma'am.
Would you discover like new insights that maybe weren't included in other histories?
Yeah, I was. Thanks for that. So, what new things or what things surprised me? In terms of things that surprised me, there was one major thing that probably never should have surprised me because I've commanded American troops for almost 30 years, and this should not have surprised me. And that is how resilient the Americans were. They're knocked down time after time after time, and they bounce back. It's just amazing. The guys who surrendered Fort Ticonderoga, and it was just in total ignominy and disgrace. They give up Fort Ticonderoga. These were the same guys that will defeat Burgoyne 2 months later. Almost all of them will be involved in those final 2 battles of Saratoga at the end. So just their ability to bounce back after disaster after disaster and keep going. So that was one of the things that surprised me that shouldn't have surprised me. And then I think I was fortunate in that I wrote the book probably 15 years after the last big book on Saratoga was written. So there are other papers that have come out. There have been translations of like German accounts and French accounts that have become available. A lot more things are available on the internet. There was one letter that appeared in actually on eBay I didn't find this letter, but I was able to capitalize on it because the National Park Service found it and bought it. And it was a new eyewitness account of the final Battle of Saratoga that completely changed. It kind of dispelled one of the myths of Saratoga. So I was able to be the first one in print on that. So I was very fortunate. My timing was right on that. And then there's, I don't know, I'd say 4 or 5 myths about Saratoga that I hope I put to bed. We'll see the other people will write about Saratoga sometime in the future, and they may say, well, I had it completely wrong, but I don't think I did. I think I had it completely right. So thank you. Great. Yes, sir. Yeah, it was the French. So the French built it during the French and Indian War period. It's called Fort. I cannot speak French, but it's called Fort Carillon, and I know that's pronounced differently in French. But so that was originally the fort. The British will try several times to seize it during the French and Indian War. In fact, General Howe's brother is killed trying to take Fort Ticonderoga during the French and Indian War. And then it will revert to the Brits later. They will rename it to Ticonderoga, and then ultimately the Americans will capture it as well. We take it from the British at the very beginning of so right after the battles of Lexington and Concord, there's a small British garrison up at Ticonderoga that have that man Ticonderoga. It's a small garrison. They think that they're far enough away from the unpleasantness that's happening around Boston that they really don't take any measures of security. There's no guards out at night or anything like that. And an American force under Benedict Arnold and Ethan Allen, the Green Mountain Boys, you maybe heard of them, they go up there and they basically knock on the door and say, "You're under arrest and this fort is ours now." It's literally without a shot. And so the Americans will capture Fort Ticonderoga there. So that's how we capture it. And we do that in May of 75. And the big guns that are at Fort Ticonderoga, famously, Henry Knox, who is a colonel in the American Army, will take those guns in the wintertime, put them on sleds, and he will drag all those guns to Boston. And those are the guns that will then Washington will mount those guns around on the hills surrounding Boston and will force the British to evacuate Boston later on in March of 76. And Boston to this day celebrate Evacuation Day. It's an actual holiday for Bostonians, Evacuation Day, the day that Washington forced the British to evacuate Boston. So great question. Yes, ma'am. Oh, yes. So, yeah, great question. So the French have been helping the Americans throughout the entire war covertly. So mainly some merchants have been doing that with the French kind of winking, the French government kind of winking at it, and telling the Brits, we're not involved. And then, because the French all along, and the Spanish are doing the same thing. Spanish are helping us out, and also the Dutch Republic will end up helping us later on with money. They won't actually sign a treaty, but they'll give us all sorts of loans, which will really kind of prop us up in those last couple of years of the war, where inflation is just going through the roof, and there's no hard currency, and the Dutch will come in and help us out tremendously. But yes, they are helping us out, and the French make it very clear. In fact, I found it actually made me really chuckle. Vergennes here, the French foreign minister, during their discussions about do we sign a treaty or not sign a treaty with the Americans and forget about all this covert help, now we're going to overtly help you out. Vergennes at one point will send a letter to Franklin, and I read it. I just had to laugh because he said, "Now because they got to be friends, they got to be pretty close." And he says, "Well, of course, that we really don't care if you guys are independent. I mean, we want you to succeed. Yes, that'd be nice, but we really want to weaken the Brits. That's what we want to do. We really don't care about you, but this is a way for us to get at the Brits." Because they had just lost the 7 Years' War. They had lost Canada. They had lost a bunch of other possessions, and they wanted to get back at the Brits in the worst way. And of course, at the time, the strategy in Europe was always balance of power. Britain, of course, had basically become an empire with the 7 Years' War, and the French did not like that. They wanted to cut them down to size. They saw this as a great opportunity. And of course, what it ended up doing, it ends up bankrupting France, which will lead to the French Revolution, and Louis XVI will end up losing his head over, in a way you can say, because of his decision to help the Americans. The British, on the other hand, they will spend a huge amount of money fighting this war, but they're able to kind of revamp their finances because they have some great leadership, especially a guy named Pitt the Younger, who becomes the youngest British Prime Minister. He's like 23 years old, and he's a British Prime Minister, and he's brilliant with numbers, and he basically kind of revamps their treasury, and so they're in great shape when it comes time for them to have to fight Napoleon. And so the Brits do great after this. The French, not so much. But we were able to get our independence. So great question. Right? Yeah. So what What you're talking about is a really interesting. So the question is about French Canadians, basically after they lose France or they lose Canada to the British. Now they're under British rule, and some of them helped the Americans. For sure, they did. And in fact, one of the reasons why Washington and Congress is so interested in getting Canada is they think that the Canadian population, mainly the French Canadian population, would naturally want to support us. And so that's why they send the expedition up there into Canada to try to get Canada on our side. But even though there are some French up there who do help us out, the vast majority of the French do not help us out. Why? You would think they would be. We'd think we'd be natural, the problem was Catholicism. And Washington wants those guys to come on our side. He thinks it would be a natural alliance. But there's so many Americans in leadership positions who want nothing to do with French Catholics. There's a big anti-Catholic sentiment in America. Maryland is really the only Catholic colony, state, and even they're not completely Catholic. So, there's a big anti-Catholic sentiment. And so there's a bunch of people in Congress who are basically saying, well, why do we want those damn Catholics helping us out? And the Canadians know that. At the same time, the Brits, who they happen to have a very enlightened governor up there named Sir Guy Carleton. He's also a general, so he's kind of the commander in chief up there in Canada. He's also the governor of Canada. He passes a law basically saying French Canadians, even Catholics, have every right that everybody else has. There will be no discrimination against French Catholics. And so the French Catholics up there go, well, the Brits are treating us better than the Americans would treat us if we came over to the American side. So the vast majority of them say, no, we're not gonna join in on this. The Brits are treating us pretty well up here. So even though they had lost their country, they think that the Brits are pretty good occupiers. They're treating them pretty well, and the Americans would be problematic. And I think they may have been onto something. Now, Washington wasn't anti-Catholic. I mean, he wanted those guys on our side, but he also wasn't the civilian leadership. So
First, went to check on French and which well, it's not because he was sort of trying to.
Oh, you're talking about the early. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah, definitely. Yeah. Oh.
That's military.
Right.
To explain that,
Yeah.
and then expound on that. You had additional thoughts about what beyond the original leadership grid, and then can you tell us how you think that would translate to the non-military leadership?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I think any of these leadership lessons are, or things you can pull from looking at leadership is transferable to any profession, any skill, any profession, and grip. I just found really interesting because it was. I do a lot of World War II stuff. I take groups to Normandy. I just came back from Normandy here recently, and I do a lot of reading on that and a lot of study in preparation. And one of the things I came across was reading Field Marshal Montgomery's, the British Field Marshal, who was, of course, heavily involved in D-Day, and reading some of his papers. And one of the things he talks about is there was a thing called grip, and that's what he called it. He called it grip. And he was always looking for commanders who had grip. And the way he described that was a commander who, if you came up to him and you said, "Where are all your guys?" He'd be able to say, "Oh, well, I've got, this brigade's here, that brigade's there, that brigade's there, this brigade's in the rear, these guys are doing this, and here's what everybody's doing." And okay, well, how are they in terms of their logistical situation? Well, I need to find more ammunition for these guys. I mean, in other words, a guy who really knew what was going on with his units, and he could give you chapter and verse on the status of everybody. So that's the type of commander Monty liked. He wanted a commander with grip. So that's what he called it. So I thought, well, that's neat. Number one, I like the term grip. And so I kind of adopted Monty's philosophy of grip and expanded it a little bit for how I evaluated all these leaders on both sides. And I said, not only did you have to have that, but you also had to have the unique ability, I think, to be a great general, and to be a great leader of any sort. You had to have the ability to think about how things are going to unfold. In other words, you have to have some idea about what's coming, how you're going to react to that, second and third order effects. You have to think through those kind of things and kind of have that ability to do that. For a military guy, okay, how is I'm planning this campaign. How do I think it's going to play out, and how do I think the enemy is going to react, and then be able to counter that. The same, a leader in a company ought to be able to do the same thing. Market. How's the market going to play out? What's going to happen when I bring this product to market? What are the forces that might prevent it from succeeding, and how can I react to that? And so that's what I used as sort of a benchmark to evaluate all the leadership of these guys, and particularly. So, for instance, looking at Washington, even though, yes, he's losing some battles, his grip, so his view of strategy and his view of how this war is going to play out, his view of how the campaign up in the north, in upstate New York, is going to play out, turns out to be almost exactly correct. So Washington is thinking ahead of how these things are going to happen and how he can best support first Schuyler and then Gates. And then I looked at all these other guys. What about Burgoyne? What about Howe? What about some of the other American commanders? So yeah, that's great. So I think those kind of techniques can be used in any profession. Yes, sir. All right. I am not going to answer that. No, other than apologizing for dodging that question. No, I just say I think this is a great opportunity for Americans to really, even if you're not into history, even if you're just kind of mildly interested, I think there's a great opportunity for us to look back at our country and all the things that we've accomplished. And yes, we're not perfect, and there's been rough patches. You could argue that today is a rough patch. I would argue that it's not nearly as rough a patch as before the American Civil War, for example. So having that kind of historic perspective, I think, is important. But just understanding that, we really are, I think, a special country because of all the things that we've done, and the fact that we're based on ideals and not nationalities, not religions and things like that. We're based on our ideals. And the thing that's great about America, I think, is we're self-correcting. We identify problems or shortcomings and we try to correct that. And we've done that over the course of our history. And I think I'm a very optimistic person when it comes to this country. I think we will continue to do so as we go into the future. So thank you.
Thank you all for joining us tonight to celebrate the 250th anniversary of our nation. And again, it's my honor to have you here tonight. Thank you very much. For anybody who would like to purchase a book or have it signed, you can go over here and meet our author. And for anybody who would like to look at our local history exhibit, please do that. Enjoy your time here. Thank you.